Section 5. Believe it or not. The slideshow. One cold January night in Saskatoon, Carol and I were invited by friends to see slides of their trip to the UK. The show was at the house of an office colleague, Ed Hagel, and his wife Alice. Another colleague, Herb Clark, and his wife Marion were also invited. It was a very cold night, minus 38 degrees Celsius, the kind of Saskatchewan winter night where you wonder whether your car will start when you want to drive home. But the Hagel home was warm and the welcome equally so. It should be noted that these were the days before smartphones and digital photographic images stored on computer. In fact, 35mm cameras and slide films such as Kodak's Kodachrome and Extrachrome had brought color photography to the height of its popularity. But amateur slide shows can be deadly, and this one took deadly to a new level. The first ominous sign was the stack of 6 Kodak carousel slide trays beside the projector. Carol, who could not abide slideshows at the best of times, looked at the stack of trays with dread verging on panic. The show was made up of the slides taken by Ed and Alice and 2 other couples during a 6-week trip around the United Kingdom. Let me be clear. The show was made up of all the slides taken by Ed and Alice and the 2 other couples during a 6-week trip around the UK. Leaving any slides out would not have done justice to each and every waking moment of the trip. Oh, and did I mention that Ed was a detail kind of guy and a monotone speaker to boot? The other thing worthy of note was the composition of the slides. There were 2 approaches to composition. A, one of the group of 6 would take the camera and take a photograph of the other 5 standing in front of some tourist attraction. Or B, a stranger would be recruited to take a photograph of all 6 standing in front of some tourist attraction. 2 winning formulae. Who could ask for more? We were thus treated to some 800 slides of the 5 or 6 travelers standing on a road or sidewalk with, for example, Stonehenge in the background, or in front of St. Paul's Cathedral, or with Land's End stretching away into the distance, or in front of the Tower of London, wherein we wished they had been imprisoned for crimes against slideshow audiences. The show turned out to be surprisingly noisy. In addition to Ed droning on and Alice chirping in, there was their little yappy dog. I was seated beside the electric fireplace, where, as usual, I was not very good at sitting still. Their little yappy dog was lying on the hearth quite close to my feet. Each time I crossed or uncrossed my legs, one of my feet would swing by about a foot in front of the dog's nose, and the dog would leap up and go, yip, yap, growl, snarl, snap, before lying down again. Thus the pattern soon became Ed, drone, 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 Ken's foot passing in front of nose of little yappy dog, yip, yap, growl, snarl, snap. Alice chirp, chirp, chirp. Ken's other foot passing in front of nose of little yappy dog, yip, yap, growl, snarl, snap. Meanwhile, Carol, who was absolutely beside herself with the boredom of it all, came up with a clever ploy. She excused herself and went to the bathroom, where she found a magazine where she hoped to outweight at least a couple of slide trays. Unfortunately for Carol, Ed immediately shut off the projector and announced that we would wait for her. I then had the pleasure of knocking gently on the bathroom door and saying, "Dear, we're waiting for you." Gentle is not the word I would choose to describe the look she gave me when she came out and realized that everyone was waiting for her. But not all members of the audience suffered to the same extent. About 3 slides into the show, Herb's head dropped down onto his chest and he went to sleep, snoring quietly. His wife Marion was embarrassed and kept poking him in the ribs, saying, "Herb, wake up, the pictures are good." Herb would raise his head, blear at 1 or 2 slides, and immediately go back to sleep. As the weeks went by, the trip, not the slideshow, although it became increasingly difficult to tell which was which, the famous British pub food of the day began to have an impact. Not only did waistbands and buttons show increasing strain, but we were able to see less and less of Stonehenge, St. Paul's, Land's End, or the Tower of London, or whichever tourist attraction was behind them. Most of us kept our observations about gains in girth to ourselves. But somewhere along the 4 or 5 week stage, Herb, responding to yet another dig in the ribs from Marion, lifted his head and remarked, "Putting on some weight, I see," and went back to sleep. There was an intermission, maybe more than one, I can't remember, in which coffee and dainties were served, after which the show resumed. When it finally came time to go, Carol and I actually welcomed the opportunity to go out into the bone-chilling Saskatoon night. We didn't care that the seats of our car were frozen stiff as a board. We sat and roared with laughter before worrying about whether the car would start. Thank heavens it did. We would have been afraid to again ring the Hagel doorbell in case they had another 6 slide trays at the ready. Suffering in silence. Nick Seminoff, a friend and colleague of mine at the Extension Division, University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon, had worked for many years before for one of the private radio stations and told me about some of his experiences. As professionals, announcers and other on-air personalities took pride in being able to deliver their material on live radio without faltering, no matter what was going on around them or being done to them. For example, an announcer was reading a newscast one day when a couple of his colleagues came soundlessly into the studio. Any noise would be picked up by the microphone and broadcast over the airwaves and moved around behind the announcer. They silently took away his chair, leaving him bent over his desk, continuing to read the news. He continued reading flawlessly. They next undid his belt, and lowering his pants, he still managed to get through the newscast without faltering. This was the sort of thing that went on. There was one trick that backfired on the perpetrator, however. Again, the announcer was reading the news when a male colleague came silently into the studio and approached the announcer's desk. He took out his penis and laid it on the desk, hoping to throw the announcer off his stride. The announcer, however, quickly hit the cough switch, which temporarily shuts off the microphone, bonked his fist down on the penis in question, hit the cough switch again, and carried on with the news. The owner of the penis then had to deal with the surprise, shock, and pain in silence. The announcer then had another problem. He had to continue trying to read the news in a normal tone and at a normal pace, while watching his colleague leaping around the office, holding his penis and screaming in agony, all without making a sound. The announcer pulled it off, unfortunate choice of words perhaps, without a hitch. JW's ring Nick's chimes. Another Nick Seminoff story. Back in the days when home winemaking was the thing to do, Nick was into home beer making. Whenever Nick tackled anything, including beer making, he did it well. He made superb beer and enjoyed the advantage it had over homemade wine. You had a drinkable product much more quickly. Thus it was that he, alone in the house that Saturday morning, was having a lovely time in the basement, racking his maturing beer from one carboy up on a bench to another down on the floor when the doorbell rang. He was using the big 5-gallon soft plastic carboys that homemade wine and beer makers used in those days. When the doorbell rang, Nick pushed the upper carboy toward the back of the bench and ran up the stairs to answer the door. There on the front step were 2 Jehovah's Witnesses, earnestly clutching their pamphlets. They started into their pitch, with Nick holding the door open, impatient to return to the basement where he would much have preferred to be. Although Nick is a very polite and courteous guy, he could not have been less interested in what his visitors had to say, and was not happy about having his beer operation interrupted. In spite of himself, he was drawn into a conversation with the people on the doorstep. He needn't have bothered. Nick was an atheist, and the JWs emphatically were not. The prospect of any conversion happening in either direction that morning on Nick's doorstep was extremely remote. He returned to the basement shaking his head. Unfortunately, the scene in the basement was not good. When he had pushed the carboy with its 5 gallons of immature beer back on the bench and rushed upstairs to answer the doorbell, he had not noticed that the beer inside was rocking quite a bit as he left. In fact, it was rocking so much that the plastic carboy walked, quote-unquote, over to the edge of the bench and fell off onto the floor. Thus, when Nick finally bid his visitors goodbye and went back downstairs, the scene that greeted him was one of sticky devastation. The carboy had split, and the beer mixture had sloshed all over the basement floor and several inches up on the surface of anything in its path. Nick is a man of several vocations and many avocations, which go far beyond what most of us think of as jobs and hobbies. When Nick tackles anything, he does so with intelligence, creativity, sound research, and excellent technical ability. So not only did the Seminoff basement at the time of the beer spill have a finished floor, there was also an amazing range and diversity of tools, workspaces, and cabinetry of a master carpenter, welder, jewelry maker, painter, sculptor, printmaker, model builder, and I could go on. Wherever the beer had sloshed, it encountered something, a wall or door, the legs of a stationary power tool, the legs of a table, workbench, or bottom of a cabinet. Nick not only had lost 5 gallons of what had promised to be a very fine batch of beer, He was now faced with having to clean the sticky beer off everything it had touched. For weeks and months after that, all we had to do at the office to get Nick going was to make some oblique reference to Jehovah's Witnesses. There would then follow a spluttering sound from Nick's direction. His eyes would bug out, his complexion would assume a reddish hue, and he would tell the story to anyone who had not previously heard it, and several who had. Leading Aircraftsman Crow. My friend Colin Hodgson was station commander of the Canadian Air Base at Holberg on Vancouver Island for a number of years in the 1970s. January and February were cold, wet, grey, and depressing months on the base. It was usually difficult to maintain morale, but one year there was some relief when the officer in charge of stores reported for work one morning. He found a dead crow on the floor of the storeroom. The sensible thing to do would have been to put the dead crow in the garbage, and that would have been the end of it. But this was the Canadian Armed Forces, so the first question was whether there was a form to fill out. Since it was a slow day, at a dismal time of year, the officer had all the time in the world to complete the form in quadruplicate about the new, previously unrecorded item to be added to the store's inventory. He sent the completed form to administration. He carefully put the crow in a box and waited. Administration received the report and opened a file. They gave the crow a name, rank, and serial number. At that point, 3 lawyers from the legal department in Victoria visited the Holberg base and were told about the leading Aircraftsman Crow case. They asked that the file be sent to them in Victoria. They then rendered an opinion and advised that it would be important from a legal standpoint to confirm that the crow was indeed dead. The body was then sent to the medical department in Victoria. The opinion came back that there was no brainwave activity, but since this was an airman, brain activity of any kind was fairly rare, so that was no guarantee that the crow was dead. Eventually, leading Aircraftsman Crow was declared dead, so a burial at sea was planned. A coffin was built to fit. An honor guard was assembled at the dock preparatory to putting out to sea for the ceremony. There was a last-minute moment of uncertainty when one of those present proposed that the file, by now some 3 inches thick, be buried at sea. Colin quickly vetoed this idea on the basis that he, after an admirable career in the Air Force, might have his career come to an ignominious and embarrassing end should the file wash up on shore and get sent to the office of his commanding officer. It was embarrassing enough to be standing on the boat preparing to jettison the little coffin while other boats cruised by, wondering what all these people in their dress uniforms were doing. To tell the age of any horse. Here's a poem that many of my readers will immediately find useful. To tell the age of any horse, inspect the lower jaw, of course. The 6 front teeth the tail will tell, and every doubt and fear dispel. 2 middle nippers you behold, before the colt is 2 weeks old. Before 8 weeks 2 more will come, 8 months the corners cut the gum. At 2 the middle nippers drop, at 3 the second pair can't stop. When 4 years old the third pair goes, at 5 a new full set he shows. The deep black spots will pass from view, at 6 years from the middle 2. The second pair at 7 years, at 8 each spot each corner clears. From middle nipper's upper jaw at 9 the black spot will withdraw. The second pair at 10 are white, 11 finds the corners light. The oval teeth 3-sided grow as time goes on, the horsemen know. They longer get, project before, till 20 when we know no more. Author unknown. Smelly Hog. The combination of names in wedding announcements can be amusing. In the early part of the 20th century, Russell, Manitoba made a contribution to the genre when the wedding of the progeny of 2 prominent Russell families was announced. The Smelly Hog Wedding. Smelly, S-M-E-L-L-I-E, stroke Hog, H-O-G-G. Drop-off. Glenn Cameron, my colleague in the farm loan inspection work at Prudential Insurance, had the task of inspecting a big ranch in British Columbia. The rancher said the only way to see his ranch was to fly over it. He led my unsuspecting colleague to his small Piper Cub aircraft parked at the edge of a small sloping field that dropped off into the valley beyond. They got in and put their seatbelts on. The rancher fired up, rolled down the slope, and dropped over the edge of the cliff, and after gaining airspeed, flew off over the ranch. After my colleague had recovered his breath and gotten his stomach back down from between his ears, he asked, "Do you always drop off the cliff like that?" "Oh," said the rancher, "it was pretty good today, bit of a headwind, usually drop more than that." Suggestions made and ignored. I once asked a McDonald's clerk whether they gave seniors discounts. She said no, but I could join their Golden Arches Club. I said if they would change the name to Fallen Arches Club, I would certainly join. Over the years, my freely offered suggestions have been ignored by some important groups. A few years ago, a committee was struck to update and improve the words of our national anthem, O Canada. Suggestions were sought from everyone and anyone. In the interest of making our national anthem more historically accurate, I suggested a simple one-word change from "and" to "on." Instead of reading "our home and native land," I suggested to better reflect reality it should read "our home on native land." I didn't hear from the committee, although several Aboriginal people I mentioned it to approved of the idea. I thought it might speed up the land claims process. Update. Of late there has been much more attention paid to righting the wrongs done to the Aboriginal inhabitants of this land by European settlers. This is partly due to a greater receptivity on the part of those of us of European stock, but more importantly, because justice is being demanded by those of Aboriginal heritage. Aboriginal leaders now include an emerging cadre of well-educated and articulate youth. Increasingly, it looks as if this is the generation when significant changes will take place. In fact, one of the current initiatives is to revisit the wording of O Canada. Then there was the search for a name for our National Museum, initially known as the Museum of Civilization, more recently as the Museum of History. It was apparent from various suggestions received that some brains out there had been pressed into service for the first time in years. One track star suggested Museum of Man. Another leapt in to correct the gender imbalance with Museum of Man and His Wife. I thought this latter suggestion was on the right track but didn't go far enough, and suggested Museum of Man and the Wife, another committee I didn't hear from. I've also suggested that the big bakeries rename their plastic-wrapped sliced white bread plumbing bread. See plumbing bread article elsewhere in this book. But for some reason this suggestion has not engendered much enthusiasm. I recently had occasion to open a personal bank account at the Royal Bank of Canada, Canada's biggest bank, in connection with some charity work. A woman from the RBC called to thank me for the new account and wanted to know what they would have to do to handle all my banking business. I replied that I had banked almost exclusively at credit unions in the last 40 years, but if RBC would convert to a credit union, I would consider switching my banking business. She didn't think that was likely to happen, but at least she hung up laughing. Some years ago, there were 3 restaurants in Ottawa with the following names: Today's, Tomorrow's, and Yesterday's. I thought that a naming opportunity was being missed last week's, but so far no one has taken me up on the idea. Nose knock. My father once called at a farm where there was a dog that he was nervous about. He made his way to the house while keeping a wary eye on the dog. Up on the stoop, he still kept his eye on the dog, shielding his eyes from the setting sun while reaching behind to knock on the front door. Meanwhile, the woman of the house had silently opened the door and was about to say hello when, to her surprise, received a knock on her nose. My father was most apologetic, but the woman, more surprised than hurt, just laughed. Perfect and generous reaction. Keen hiker number 1. The Hudsons, great friends of ours, were on a hiking trip up around the north end of Vancouver Island. It is one of the highest rainfall areas in Canada, averaging about 1,180 millimeters, 48.5 inches of rain annually. True to form, it rained before, during, and after their hike. Not only that, the distinguishing feature of the trail was deep mud. After slogging through calf-deep mud for more than an hour, Sharon, their littlest kid, just couldn't keep up with her parents and older brothers. She didn't give up easily, but this was too much. In great frustration, she said, "Dad, would you carry me? I'm the worst hiker in the world, even worse than Mom." Keen hiker number 2. At the age of 8, grandson Ben was not a keen hiker. Thus, the tramp up a New Hampshire mountain with the rest of his family had put him in a thoroughly grumpy mood. At some point he said, "This is the worst day of my life," to which his father Dave replied, "Well, Ben, I think it's a very good thing to get the worst day of your life over with by the age of 8. Ben may not have been a keen hiker, but he has always had a fine sense of humor, and try as he might, he could not keep a little smile from curling the corners of his mouth. This might be the place to include 2 poems in celebration of rain. Rain. It rained and it rained and rained and rained. The average fall was well maintained, and when the tracks were simply bogs, it started raining cats and dogs. After about half an hour, we had a most refreshing shower, and then the most curious thing of all, a gentle rain began to fall. Next day was also fairly dry, save for the deluge from the sky, which wetted the party to the skin. After that, the rain set in. Anonymous. The rain it raineth on the just, and on the unjust fellow, but mostly on the just because the unjust hath the just's umbrella. Lord Justice Bowen. Doppler effect. We were driving along in South Africa when we met a pickup truck coming towards us. The dog in the back of the truck was barking as the truck came towards us, still barking as it passed, and still barking as it went on its way behind us. The barking sounded quite high-pitched as the truck came towards us, sliding to a lower pitch as it passed, and sounding much lower in pitch as it receded away from us. I said, "Hey, that dog knows the Doppler effect." And Dave said, "Yes," and we both said, "Wonder how long it took them to train it." None of the other family members said anything. They either didn't know what we were talking about, didn't hear us, or chose to ignore us. I hope my readers will appreciate having some scientific bits inserted here and there. The Doppler effect, named after Christian Doppler, is a change in frequency and wavelength of a sound wave that is perceived by an observer, moving relative to the source of the waves. All you need to do to test the Doppler effect is arrange to have a truck carrying a barking dog meet you on the road. If that's not convenient, you can also hear the effect during an air show when a plane flies over your head. As it comes towards you, the noise will be higher in pitch than when it has flown past. Same thing on a train, sounding its whistle as it goes by. Truly tolerant. My longtime friend Chuck Page developed a passion for sailing, which meant he bought sailboats, repaired sailboats, built sailboats, towed sailboats on trailers, and sold sailboats. He even sailed sailboats. His wife Barbara, for whom I am filled with admiration, was not as keen on sailing as Chuck, but being the good partner that she is, she suffered along with great forbearance. One of their early boats was relatively small and required the crew, that would be Barbara, to hang out over the water to keep the boat from heeling over too far. I don't know all the technical sailing terms, but I think that Barbara, in addition to being crew, was also ballast. So there was Chuck, captain's cap set at a jaunty angle, hand on tiller, steely gaze into the wind, barking commands at the crew. For example, "More ballast," meaning lean out further. And there was Barbara, holding on for dear life, out in the wind and spray, occasionally getting dunked completely under the cold water, maintaining the age-old tradition of obedient crew doing the bidding of an autocratic captain. A comparison with Captain Queeg would not be out of place here. I'm sure Chuck has his moments, but from my perspective, Barbara has been a heroic partner, indulging Chuck's numerous eccentricities with equanimity. For example, in the early days of their marriage, Chuck became an archery enthusiast. Their first home in Winnipeg was an apartment featuring a long hallway with the living room at one end and a linen closet at the other. The other rooms of the apartment, kitchen, bathroom, and bedroom, were accessible from the hallway. This meant that the linen closet was almost 30 feet away from the far living room wall. Chuck could set up his archery target against the linen closet door, stand with his back to the living room wall, and have a reasonable shooting range right at home. It also meant that arrows would be whizzing by the doors of the other rooms with heart-stopping regularity. It also meant that the new bride had to call out, "Don't shoot," before going from one room to another. Fortunately, there were no accidents, no doubt due to Barbara's being constantly on the alert. Also fortunately, perhaps, the landlord was less than impressed by the occasional miss when arrows hit the wall or pierced the linen closet door, and came to the conclusion that these particular tenants were not ideally suited to apartment living. In fact, the landlord may have, without knowing it, prevented an accident that was just waiting to happen, if Chuck had failed to hear the don't and don't shoot due to traffic noise or a passing thunderstorm. They moved to a house, and not long after that, Chuck developed his passion for sailing. I suspect that Barbara was willing to put up with getting cold and wet as Chuck's crew because it was less dangerous than having arrows whizzing by her kitchen door all the time. Several years and several boats later, when we were in Botswana, we got a letter from Chuck and Barbara. They each wrote about their recent sailing holiday on Lake Winnipeg. They obviously hadn't read what each other had written, so their respective sentiments came through unedited. Chuck wrote, "We had a 2-week sailing holiday on Lake Winnipeg. Unfortunately, there were 3 days when it was too windy to sail, but otherwise it was a good holiday. Barbara wrote, "We had a 2-week sailing holiday on Lake Winnipeg. It was a bit long, but fortunately, there were 3 days when it was too windy to sail. There is no doubt in my mind that my old buddy Chuck has a truly tolerant wife. Postscript, I should hasten to mention, before others beat me to it, that other wives have from time to time had to put up with certain eccentricities on the part of their husbands. There, I've said it, and I don't want to hear anything more about it." Note, Captain Queeg was a fictional character in Herman Wouk's 1951 novel, The Cane Mutiny. Glenn Prankster Haas. Glenn Haas was the excellent director of Saskatchewan 4-H in my time working in the Extension Division at the University of Saskatchewan. He was an unrepentant prankster. One prank occurred on the first evening of a 4-H leader training workshop at Camp Rainier. Camp Rainier was at that time an institutional camp owned and operated by the Saskatchewan 4-H Council Foundation. The camp was located on Lake Diefenbaker, the lake created when dams were built across the South Saskatchewan and Qu'Appelle rivers south of Saskatoon. Camp Rainier was used for camps for 4-H members as well as for 4-H leader training workshops, such as the one described here. The leaders arrived in late afternoon, had supper, attended an evening introductory and fun session, and retired for the night. The simple but pleasant cabins were situated in a wooded area of poplar trees close to the main lodge. Each cabin slept 8 in its 4 double bunk beds. One leader, a representative from Cargill Corporation and new to the 4-H Council, had advised Glenn in advance that he would not be arriving until around midnight on the first day. Glenn arranged that a lower bunk nearest to the door of one of the cabins be left unoccupied for the late arrival, so he could sneak in without disturbing the others. Glenn and a couple of women were in on the prank and had removed a light bulb so the cabin would be in total darkness. The leader duly arrived sometime after midnight, and Glenn showed him to the cabin, telling him to sneak quietly into the lower bunk without turning on any lights. Glenn neglected to mention that it was a women's cabin. The next morning, as the women were up getting dressed, one of them noticed that the sleeper in the lower bunk by the door needed a shave. There was much screaming and confusion, as women quickly grabbed sheets and blankets to cover themselves. The Cargill guy woke with a start, shouted, "Jesus Christ," and ran out of the cabin in his underwear. Those who were not in on the joke confronted Glenn at breakfast. He at first tried to pretend that it was an innocent mistake. When that didn't wash, he said he felt he had an obligation to make these training workshops as interesting and entertaining as possible. 5 in tow. My friend Lloyd Mitchell, sadly no longer with us, was a fine mechanic employed by McCullough, a company that made excellent chainsaws and outboard motors. One day near Lloyd's cottage at Bird Lake, Manitoba, a group of us guys with nothing better to do on a Sunday afternoon decided to see how many water skiers we could get up behind the 75 horsepower motor mounted on one of the boats. This was one of the most powerful outboard motors made at the time. We went to a suitable beach. Lloyd was driving the boat. Getting 2 skiers up behind a boat was routine, so we tried 3. No problem. All 3 got up first try, so we tried 4. The motor strained a bit, but after dragging us along for a short distance, with only our ski tips up out of the water, all 4 of us popped up and whipped around the lake in great style. We decided to try for 5 skiers. A 5th rope was attached, and the 5th guy got into position. The 5th guy was rather portly. Lloyd hit the power, and the engine strained mightily to move all that beef through the water. We plowed along, trying in vain to get up, but no dice. Everyone's arms were getting tired from holding the rope while plowing through the water, but the fat guy's arms were obviously killing him, and he had to let go. The boat immediately spurted ahead, and the 4 of us again popped up and skied happily around the lake. We tried 3 more times to get 5 guys up, but the same thing happened each time. The fat guy had to let go, letting the rest of us pop up and ski around the lake again. The motor had obviously reached its lard limit when the 5th guy was in tow. Churchill River. It was 2002, and we were living in Ottawa, leading a safe, quiet life, when we suddenly lost our minds and agreed to go on a 12-day whitewater canoe trip on the Churchill River in northern Saskatchewan. With my 70th birthday coming up later that year, there wasn't a moment to lose. The invitation came from Paul and Nancy Wilkinsons, dear friends and former owners of a fishing outfitters camp at Mississippi near Otter Rapids, north of La Ronge in Saskatchewan. There would be 8 canoeists in 4 canoes outfitted by the Wilkinsons, who had retained a supply of outfitting equipment from their fishing camp days. They knew the Churchill River well, having operated their camp there for 13 years. They had a wealth of experience, as had some of the other members of the group, both in long, self-contained wilderness canoe trips and in canoeing in whitewater conditions. Carol and I had little experience with whitewater canoeing. We faced a steep learning curve and a lot of very hard work. I must have masochistic tendencies because I loved it all. In addition to the Wilkinsons and the Shipleys, the party included Nina and Marv Have and Thelma Howard and Rob Lowen, each twosome in one of the other 2 canoes. Paul and Nancy knew the territory best and had the trip extremely well organized. The supplies included maps and charts and canoe trip information, a satellite phone in case of emergencies, and all the provisions and equipment we would need. Rob turned out to be a very skilled canoeist. Thelma started off not being all that confident about her canoeing ability, but when she realized what an outstanding canoeist she had in the stern, she was able to relax and really enjoy the trip. Rob was probably even better at reading rapids than Paul, but together they made a fine leadership team. Nancy was extremely skilled at organizing the food. The Churchill River is one of Canada's magnificent rivers. It issues from Churchill Lake in northwestern Saskatchewan and flows eastward 1,000 miles across the lowlands of northern Saskatchewan and Manitoba to Hudson's Bay. It has rapids, falls, narrow chutes, long placid stretches of smooth water, and typical of rivers of the Canadian Shield, is not so much a river as a complex of interconnected lakes, many of them so large and so filled with islands that you need a detailed map to determine where the river flows out. The river was named after John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, governor of the Hudson's Bay Company, 1685 to 1691. The Cree called the river Mississippi, meaning Big River. Too bad the Cree name didn't stick. This is really an old part of Canada. Early explorers and later the fur traders used the rivers in the northern reaches of the prairie provinces as the highways of the day. To begin the trip, friends of Nancy and Paul drove a van filled with barrels of food, supplies, our personal effects. The van pulled a trailer loaded with 4 canoes. We intrepid canoeists rode in the second vehicle some 250 miles upstream to our launch site. It had rained hard that day, so the roads were muddy and slippery. We arrived in the late afternoon at Snake Rapids, near the settlement of Pine House Lake. Because of the rain and strong winds, we decided to camp there for the night and start our trip in the morning. This was in July, which some fool in the group made the mistake of observing was one of the months of summer. He quickly stopped talking about summer as the temperature dropped to 3 degrees Celsius, rain began falling mixed with snow, and a 40-kilometer gale howled through the tops of the spruce trees. He knew he was in danger of being buried in a snowbank for the night if he mentioned summer again. Things looked better in the morning, in that it had warmed up to 4 degrees Celsius. There was no longer any sign of snow, and there wasn't even much rain. The wind still blew at gale force, making whitecaps on the large lake we had to cross. The weather was poor for much of the trip, with some slightly warmer days and a glimpse of the sun on 1 or 2 afternoons. Paul said the weather was more like October in the north, not July. The weather wasn't his fault, but the rest of us gave him a hard time about it anyway. Nancy and Paul remember being very concerned that we would get swamped by waves that were too big for the equipment we were using and for the canoeing skills of most of us. We waited until noon, but there was no let-up in the wind, so we decided we should get going. We broke camp and cast off with the gale still blowing. We were dealing with 2-foot waves in heavily loaded canoes. We could not relax because the canoes could be swamped at any moment if we let our guard down. As we crossed the lake, the waves were coming at us from the port side. Note the use of nautical language. That's left for you landlubbers who have the good sense to stay on dry land. This necessitated turning the canoe into each wave as it hit, then back to starboard, the right side, in order to make some headway through the trough of the wave before having to swing to the port again to quarter into the next wave. The job of steering a canoe falls primarily to the steersman, who, with respect to our canoe, was working very hard in this first stage of the trip, make no mistake. Whether by good luck or good management, probably the former, we all got through it. Our struggle with the waves in the lake ended when we came to our first set of rapids, Class 1. It was at this point that the International System of Classification of Rapids, known as the International Scale of River Difficulty, ISRD, became more than a theoretical concept. The ISRD sets out 6 classes of rapids. Class 1, easy, like the first rapids we encountered. Class 2, moderate. Class 3, moderately difficult. Class 4, difficult. Class 5, extremely difficult. And Class 6, extraordinarily difficult. If you've ever seen the Niagara River below Niagara Falls, that's a Class 6. That's what's meant by extraordinarily difficult. Whitewater rapids occur when a river or stream runs down a steep slope over or through rocks. The rocks may be far below the surface, just below the surface, or showing above the water. The combination of rocks and fast-moving water can create spectacular sights. Sometimes the water foams and froths, heaves and rolls, and shoots spray into the air. Sometimes, if there is a big rock just under the surface, the river can form a standing wave. Such waves can be monsters, sometimes the size of a city bus. Sometimes the river roars downstream in a series of steps or small waterfalls. If such waterfalls extend across the river, the rapid is not runnable by canoe. If a waterfall does not extend all the way across the river, a skilled canoeist may be able to find a way down, beside or around the waterfall. Rapids can change depending on the volume of water going through. In the spring, in addition to the increased volume of water from melting snow, trees and branches ripped from the shores may also be in the flow. Early summer is the best time to tackle a fast river. Later in the summer and fall, falling water levels can bring more rocks into play, making passage through by canoe even more difficult. In fact, the classification of a rapid can change with a change in water levels. Skilled whitewater canoeists know how to read the river, quote unquote, which means choosing the best line to follow down the rapid. For example, they know that a V can form when fast water flows down past 2 adjacent exposed rocks, where the water will usually be deep enough for a canoe to go through safely. They also know to look for eddies, quiet places near the shore where water swings back upstream. That's where a canoeist can rest, bail water, and reorganize or repack before continuing down the rapid. The first rapid we encountered on the Churchill was a Class 1, so Carol and I coasted through comfortably and enjoyably after the experience of the waves on the lake. We found that we could manage Class 2 rapids reasonably well too, but Class 3 rapids were a real challenge for us. You have to be able to read the river, pick a route, and stick to it. We got better as the trip went on, but here's what one website says about Class 3 rapids. These rapids are best left to canoeists with expert skills. We were reasonable canoeists, but not expert. We had expert canoeists in the group, however, and that added greatly to the excitement and enjoyment of the trip, as they helped us to handle various classes of rapids, including not trying them when it wasn't prudent to do so. Alternatively, sometimes we would walk the path while the expert, Rob in the stern, Paul in the bow, took each canoe down a Class 3. That way we avoided having to portage as well as risking an upset. Sometimes a Class 3 rapid is upgraded to a Class 4 because of length. It is easier to work out the line for running a 100 or 150 meter rapid than one that is 1 or more kilometers long. With the long rapid, in addition to the extra stamina required, you have to be able to read situation after situation instantly and choose the best line through the rapids. The first set of Class 1 rapids was followed immediately by a second set that were at least Class 3, possibly Class 4. We were compelled to portage around them. Portaging was a lot of work. Outfitters really know how to pack, putting everything that should stay dry in waterproof packs or containers, the most impressive of which were the food barrels. Not only were the food barrels waterproof, but they had shoulder straps so you could carry them on your back. Our equipment also included tents, sleeping bags, clothing, personal items, cook stoves, camp fuel, lanterns, tools, and health kits, all wrapped in heavy-duty plastic to keep everything dry and safe. Every item had to be tied to the canoe to prevent it from being carried away in the current in case of upset. All this had to be unloaded from the canoes and carried along the portage, involving 3 or 4 trips by each of the 8 canoeists. 4 of the portages involved the men carrying the canoes on their backs. A conventional canoe weighs at least 70 pounds and is awkward to carry, especially on uneven soil or difficult footing, which means everything from black, sticky muck that threatens to suck your boot right off your foot, to round, coconut-like rocks that start rolling if you even look at them, to slippery sloping tree roots, to loose shale, or a combination of all of the above. There were about 12 portages in total, ranging in length from a few yards to 2 kilometers. None of the women in the group was strong enough to portage a canoe. I wasn't strong enough to lift a canoe onto my shoulders without help, but once it was up there, I could walk along with it fairly well. The technique we used was to lash 2 paddles to the thwarts. The paddles served both as shoulder rests and handholds as we walked along. The first 3 portages brought about a change in the attitude of my paddling partner towards paddling through the rapids. She went from being quite nervous about shooting even a Class 2 rapid to a devil-may-care let's-go-for-it attitude even when a Class 3 showed up around the bend. By then she had a basis for comparison. She could compare the hard work of portaging with the thrill of a fast, bouncy, exciting ride down a rapid, where one basically hangs on while trying to steer around rocks and standing waves. If you managed to get down without upsetting, we did, or shipping a lot of water and getting soaked, we didn't, it seemed very much worth it. I wasn't as skilled in the stern at steering around obstacles in white water as Rob and Paul, so there was more risk of upsetting or damaging the canoe when Carol and I were attempting to run a Class 3. As already mentioned, Carol and I sometimes walked the bank while Paul and Rob ran our loaded canoe through. Once, after Rob and Paul had checked out a Class 3 and run it successfully, they said Carol and I should try it. They said there was one tricky spot where a hard left turn was required to avoid trouble. Rob very kindly waded in from the shore and stationed himself thigh-deep at the trouble spot. He was there to give us help if we needed it. Sure enough, as we approached the spot, we failed to steer hard enough to the left, so Rob gave our bow a push at the right moment, and we went through without difficulty. He did the same for Nina and Marv, who had about the same canoeing skills as Carol and I. Lunch stop on the Churchill. One day during a lunch stop on a nice sloping rock, some of us, after 5 or 6 days of being part of the Great Unwashed, decided that a cleansing, not to say refreshing swim would be a good idea. This, after all, was the Churchill, so calling it refreshing was not putting it too strongly. With the water temperature at 7 degrees, the best that could be said for it was that it was above freezing. We were no doubt inspired by the rare appearance of the sun that afternoon. Those of us who went in didn't want to suffer alone, so we kept yelling to the others about how excellent and refreshing and cleansing it was. So why didn't they come in too? We couldn't convince them, as they, after testing the water, could be heard muttering about not really being that much in need of a bath after all. Those of us who had bathed tried not to be too self-righteous about it, but on reflection, we didn't try all that hard. The fact that we kept talking about the need to stand upwind from them so their smell would drift off in the other direction probably didn't help. There's nothing more self-righteous, not to say insufferable, than people who have gone for a very cold swim, lording it over those who haven't. Paddling upstream. I mentioned earlier that the direction of our trip was downstream, and that we saw few other people on the river. One exception was 2 teachers, a husband and wife team from Minnesota, who were spending the summer complete with dog, canoeing from their home to Alaska. They couldn't do it all by canoe, but were doing as much as possible on the water. Sometimes their route took them downstream, for example, the Red River in North Dakota and Manitoba, but sometimes they had to fight their way upstream, such as the Churchill in northern Saskatchewan, where we saw them. This couple was young and incredibly fit. They swung by to say hello and then headed off upstream. Their powerful strokes put them out of sight around the next bend before we knew it. Rock paintings. One day on the Churchill River, we were fortunate to see rock paintings on a cliff wall near one of our campsites. It was a moving sight, in fact a spiritual experience. Saskatchewan has about 70 of the 700 or so rock painting sites found in the Canadian Shield, also known as the Precambrian Shield or Laurentian Shield. These paintings were done by indigenous people about 2,000 years ago. Here were these ancient paintings in this remote location, not protected in any way, with not even any do not touch signs. Yet there was no graffiti on the rock face, no refuse below it, and it was possible to climb the cliffside and stand right up against the paintings. The longevity of such paintings by the Aboriginal painters of so long ago is largely because they used a tough glue called isinglass, an organic substance made from the swimming bladders of fish and mixed with ochre to give them their color. We would be hard-pressed to find a modern paint that we would be confident would last 2,000 years. Meals on the Churchill. We took turns making meals, and being an early riser, I became the official camp alarm clock. I got up and walked from tent to tent, singing a different wake-up song every morning. Some of the songs got a little randy as I began to run short of material, or couldn't remember all the words of some old camp song that I hadn't sung for 3 decades. One of the songs was Saskatchewan, containing "And Gabriel blows his trumpet sound, and says the rain she's gone around." I mentioned the outstanding planning of our trip by Nancy and Paul Wilkinson. This included some perishable food that needed to be used in the first few days of the trip, after which we had to rely more on dry and freeze-dried foods. The expectation and hope was that we would catch fish for our main meal every day or so. There was enough food to see us through even if we didn't catch fish, but when we did, we certainly enjoyed it. The fishing in northern Saskatchewan is superb, and when we came to a likely spot and took time out to fish, we were usually rewarded with enough for a sumptuous meal. Pickerel, in particular, are absolutely delicious when filleted and cooked within minutes of being caught in the cold northern waters. Northern pike are perfectly tasty fish in these circumstances, but pickerel are a delicacy on another level. Beavering around. Before Carol and I flew west for our Churchill River canoe trip, we had heard from Thelma Howard that she was worried that she might have to control her canoe from the stern and had been out at Pike Lake practicing. She happened to go on a windy day and was blown bow first against a beaver house. She attempted to back away but got blown up against the beaver house again and again and again and again. In fairness to Thelma, it is very difficult to control a canoe by yourself on a lake on a windy day. In fact, she may have been sitting in the stern, which is the wrong place to sit when paddling alone. The best way to paddle a canoe by yourself is to sit backwards on the bow seat facing the stern. That situates you closer to the middle of the canoe than if you sit in the stern facing the bow. Even then, it's not easy to paddle a canoe in the wind by yourself. Thelma was fortunate to escape after only a few encounters with the beaver house. Anyway, as we drove north from the Churchill, I commented that it was good that we were on our way because the Pike Lake beavers would have some peace and quiet without Thelma's canoe banging repeatedly into their house. After that, whenever we passed a beaver house, as we paddled the Churchill, I would remark that there were no beavers in sight, so obviously the Churchill River beavers had received an email from the Pike Lake beavers advising them to stay out of sight until that crazy woman had passed by. I was telling this story and ending by saying that Thelma had finally said, "Would you just shut up about the beavers?" She overheard and insisted she hadn't said that. I told her she would have if she'd thought of it. Nonsense on the Churchill. Fun at white man's expense. During the trip, Paul told us a few stories about what it was like running a fishing outfitter's operation. There was always some problem or emergency to be dealt with. Smashed canoes, injuries, health problems, damaged or lost equipment, all of which invariably happened at inopportune times. Paul had people he could call on short notice, when he needed them. On one occasion, he got a distress call in the late afternoon and hired one of his good local Indian guides to help him deal with the situation. It was going to be an after-dark trip on the always tricky Churchill River. The guide was a very experienced outdoorsman, so Paul let him take the tiller. They had just entered the first rapid when the guide throttled back and stopped to light a cigarette. As the boat drifted backwards toward the rocks, Paul started regretting letting the guide take the tiller and began wondering if he was going to lose his $2,500 outfit. The guide throttled up at the last second and powered up through the rapids without difficulty. Fun little trick played by Indian on nervous white man. Otter Rapids. As we neared the end of our trip and were returning to the town of Mississippi, where we began our journey, a final dramatic whitewater experience awaited us. Otter Rapids is a magnificent Class 3 rapid, 400 meters long, where the Churchill River passes under the bridge on Highway 102, 6 kilometers north of Mississippi. The great thing about Otter Rapids is that the water is deep, so even if you upset, you and your canoe will be swept along into calmer water with no danger of injury or damage from the rocks below. The plan was to have some fun while trying this challenging rapid with canoes empty of everything except paddles and life jackets. That way, if we upset, we wouldn't get any of our belongings wet, just ourselves and our canoe. This required Rob Lowen and Paul Wilkinson to run the 4 loaded canoes down the rapids to calm water, where they could be pulled up on shore and emptied. We then carried the canoes back up the 500-yard portage for the fun run down the rapids. I'd like to be able to report that Carol and I ran the Otter Rapids flawlessly, but I can't. We managed to get through without upsetting, but we did take on some water. Good thing we didn't try it with a loaded canoe. Otter Rapids was an exhilarating end to a memorable and challenging wilderness canoe trip. Although we had unseasonably cold and cloudy weather during the trip, we were treated to glorious sunsets. What made the sunsets in the north particularly impressive are the crimson and rose splashes of color in the sky. What a fabulous experience the trip was for all of us. Hard work, cold weather, wind, rain, it didn't matter. It was a wonderful opportunity to experience one of Canada's magnificent northern rivers by canoe. Fish story. I was fortunate for a number of years to go on several wonderful fishing trips with the Boychuk Construction Group to Lac La Ronge in northern Saskatchewan. Lac La Ronge is a fabulous lake, 235 kilometers north of Prince Albert. See elsewhere for a more complete description of Lac La Ronge. One day, Mike and Dick decided to spend the morning fishing for pickerel, known as walleye in the USA. Their guidebook took them to a great pickerel spot. It was a beautiful morning, perfect fishing conditions, at least from a human point of view. No one thought to ask the fish. They began casting. Mike cast and caught a pickerel first cast. Dick cast and caught nothing. Mike busied himself with taking the fish off the hook. Dick cast, again, nothing. Dick cast again, nothing. Mike cast and caught a pickerel second cast. Dick cast again, nothing. Mike busied himself in taking the fish off the hook. Dick cast again and caught nothing. This pattern continued for 30 minutes, with Mike catching a fish every first or second cast and Dick catching nothing. Finally, Dick said, "The fish must all be on your side of the boat. How about we change sides?" Mike said fine, and they changed sides. Mike then caught a fish on his first cast on what would have been Dick's side of the boat. Dick cast on what had been Mike's side of the boat and caught nothing. The same pattern continued, with Mike catching a fish almost every cast and Dick catching none. Finally, Mike said it was finding it very tiring having to catch fish for both of them, so he thought he'd better lie back and have a beer. Dick kept casting with no luck. It was, for Dick, beginning to be a much less perfect morning for fishing than he had anticipated. Meanwhile, Mike was enjoying his beer while toying absently with the bottle cap. He said to no one in particular, "I wonder if it would be possible to catch a fish with a bottle cap." He took out his pocket knife and fiddled around with the bottle cap until he could attach it to a hook. He cast, and, of course, caught a fish first cast. Dick swore for 30 seconds straight without repeating himself once and said to the guide, "Take me back to camp. There's no way I'm going to keep fishing with this SOB." Of course, this story of Mike and Dick fishing for pickerel became part of the shared memories and banter of that particular group of fishing buddies. Dick would invariably be asked if he had caught any pickerel with a bottle cap lately. The ugly pelican. The Churchill River is home to thousands of pelicans. Their common name is American white pelican, and they migrate each spring back from southern USA and northern Mexico to many parts of northern Canada, including northern Saskatchewan. Their feathers are white, ringed with black on the trailing edges of their wings, visible only in flight. Except for the California condor, these pelicans are the biggest birds in North America. One flock of pelicans spends the summers on several small rocky islands just below Needle Falls on the Churchill River. The flock is safe there from otters, wild mink, and other swimming predators who are always watching for a chance to eat pelican eggs and baby pelicans. Mind you, even living out on the little rocky islands, pelican parents still have to keep a sharp eye on the sky because of the crows, hawks, and eagles that are always on the lookout for a tasty snack. There was something unusual about the Needle Falls pelicans the summer we were there. One of them was a Canada goose. Whenever we passed by these rocky islands in our canoe, there was the goose right in the middle of the pelicans. Whenever we got too close and the pelicans took off, the goose would take off with them. After we got past, the pelicans would fly back, and the goose would fly back with them. Very strange. Why was this goose living with pelicans and not with other geese? We thought it might have something to do with imprinting. Baby birds learn to act like adult birds by watching their parents and other adult birds as they grow up. Turkeys learn that they are turkeys and learn how to act like turkeys by growing up with other turkeys. But if a turkey egg gets mixed in with a bunch of hen's eggs by mistake, the little turkey hatches out along with the little chicks and is looked after by the mother hen and lives with the chicks. The baby turkey begins to think it's a chicken. What you have then is a turkey with an identity crisis. The last thing you need around the barnyard is a turkey with an identity crisis. Turkeys aren't the brightest bulbs in the barnyard to begin with. We thought the Needle Falls goose might have the same problem. Maybe somehow when the goose was very young, or perhaps still in its egg, it got mixed in with the pelicans. Let's call the goose Garfield and imagine the kind of thing that might have been said by Garfield and his pelican friends. Peter Pelican. Hey, I'm hungry. My gullet sack thinks my beak's been glued shut. Let's fly over to Needle Falls and eat some fish. Penelope Pelican. Great idea. Let's see if Garfield wants to come. Hey, stupid, you coming to catch some fish? Garfield Pelican. No thanks. I'll just stay here and eat these water shoots, seeds, and insects. Penelope Pelican. That's silly. If you'd eat some fish, your feathers would be white like ours instead of that dirty gray color. Garfield Pelican. Well, fish give me indigestion, but I'll fly over later and see how you're doing. Peter Pelican. Speaking of flying, I have to admit that you can really get off the water fast. You just flap once and you're up. It's amazing. We have to flap and pit-a-pat across the water with our feet before we can get airborne. Penelope Pelican. Yeah, but it's so, unpelican-like. If you're going to be a proper pelican, you have to look and act like a pelican. Garfield looks like a freak. It didn't get any better as the weeks went by during that short, beautiful Churchill River summer. Garfield Pelican continued to like water shoots and seeds and insects better than fish. His feathers didn't get any whiter, and he started to honk, which was really embarrassing. Who ever heard of a honking pelican? The only thing he could do well was fly. He could fly like a breeze. Everyone had to admit that, even though he didn't look any more like a pelican up in the air than he did down on the rocks. As the summer came to an end, the pelicans began to make plans for the long flight south. Garfield Pelican made plans too, although he wasn't looking forward to the trip. He'd have to slow down to stay even with the others. And the other pelicans complained that his faster wing beat created turbulence that made it harder for them to fly. No, Garfield Pelican wasn't looking forward to the trip. Then, one day, Garfield Pelican heard a honking sound up in the sky. He looked up, and there was a flying V of birds heading south. It was very exciting, and he went to find Peter and Penelope Pelican. "Hi," he said. "Look at that flying V. Doesn't that look great? Let's go up and fly with them for a while." "Certainly not, you goose," said Penelope Pelican. "Who wants to fly with that bunch of bird brains?" "Hey," said Peter Pelican. He was always saying hey. "Come to think of it, you look a lot like that bunch up there." "What kind of birds are they?" asked Garfield Pelican. "They're Canada geese," said Penelope Pelican. "Everyone knows that." And that's how Garfield found out that his last name wasn't Pelican, but Goose. He was really Garfield Goose. He caught the next V going south and never tried to be a pelican again. For this story, I've shamelessly taken inspiration from the story of the Ugly Duckling by Hans Christian Andersen. Pelican Limerick by Edward Lear. A wonderful bird is the pelican. His beak can hold more than his belly can. He can hold it in his beak, enough food for a week, but I'm darned if I know how the hell he can. Loosey Goosey. While we were on the subject of geese, one day we heard some honking and looked up to see the familiar V pattern that Canada geese use when they migrate over long distances. The V helps them to save energy because the front goose cuts the air and the geese flying behind and slightly to one side benefit from the slipstream of the lead goose. Similarly, on down the V, each following goose has to use less energy because of the goose immediately ahead. When the lead goose gets tired, another takes its place and it drops back along the V where it doesn't have to work as hard. This is how geese help each other as they fly in V formation over great distances. The V we saw that day was different. There were about 30 geese along the left leg of the V, but only 2 on the right. What could be the reason? Here's what we thought. We guessed that goose number 2 on the right side was a loose goose, and the ones that had been flying behind the loose goose had run out of windshield washer fluid, so they moved to the left leg of the V. You can't really blame them. How would you like to fly behind a loose goose? Actually, if I can be serious for a moment, these geese had probably just taken off and hadn't had time to get the V better balanced. I was just testing it with the loose goose nonsense. Lac La Ronge. The lake called Lac La Ronge is spectacularly beautiful. Highlights include cliffs, more than 1,300 tree-covered islands, whitewater rapids and waterfalls, and other features typical of the Canadian Shield. The area is famous for its excellent canoeing, fishing, and cross-country skiing in winter. The lake is 40 miles long and about 546 square miles in area. The southern part of the lake reaches only about 60 feet in depth, while locations in Hunter Bay to the east reach a depth of more than 130 feet. Lac La Ronge is noted for its lake trout, northern pike, and pickerel. The lake has been frequented by fur traders since Peter Pond built a trading post on its shore in 1781. Lac La Ronge Provincial Park extends across its northern end. The resort village of La Ronge on the western shore of the lake is 140 miles northeast of Prince Albert. The French place name is probably derived from the word ronger, to gnaw, referring to the work of the beaver, which inhabits the forested islands and shores. Lac La Ronge First Nation Reserve, based in north-central Saskatchewan, is the largest First Nation reserve in Saskatchewan and one of the 10 largest in Canada, with a registered population of 831 people as of August 2009. The reserve lands extend from rich farmlands in central Saskatchewan all the way north through the boreal forest to the mighty Churchill River and beyond. Because of its depth, Hunter Bay on the eastern end of the lake is an ideal habitat for lake trout and is therefore the location of several fishing camps of Lac La Ronge. In summer, these fishing camps are only accessible by boat or float plane. It is easy to get lost among the many islands of Lac La Ronge. The islands and shore in that part of northern Saskatchewan are covered with dense boreal forest. From a distance, you can't tell which are islands and which is shore. The shoreline has many bays, streams, inlets, rocky outcrops, reefs, and shoals, so finding one's way can be very difficult for an inexperienced wayfarer. Experienced fishing guides on the lake know it like the back of their hand and can navigate the 40 miles through the islands easily, even at night. Inexperienced guides can very easily get lost in the maze of islands and end up in any number of dead-end bays that will not get them to where they want to go, especially at night. Freight prop. I heard this story secondhand, but several things about it appeal to me, so I'm including it here. This story and the one elsewhere in this book entitled Fun at White Man's Expense are illustrations of the native sense of humor that I find delightful. In both cases, Indians use their superior knowledge of the natural world, their world, to play a gentle trick on a white person, in effect, an outsider to their world. A University of Saskatchewan student was delighted to have a summer job as a guide for one of the fishing camps on Hunter Bay at the eastern end of Lac La Ronge. He had been to the camp before, but had not actually had to pilot a boat through the islands on his own. Thus, when he arrived at the dock in the town of La Ronge, where he would begin his summer job, his first task was to ferry a boatload of fishermen to the camp. There would be 3 other boatloads making the trip, so his plan was to follow the experienced native guides in making his way through the islands. They got the boats all loaded up, and the guide said, "You take that one," indicating the boat the student was to drive. All 4 boats took off, but funny thing, the other 3 boats were clearly faster than his. Try as he might, the student's boat couldn't keep up, and he was dismayed to see them disappearing into the first channel between the islands and out of sight. He was left to find his own way in the gathering evening darkness. He was very fortunate that he ended up in only 2 dead-end bays before finding his way to Hunter Bay and the fishing camp well after dark. The other guides met him on the dock to help him unload while asking a few questions about how come he didn't keep up, what took him so long, etc. It was the same old story. Greenhorns invariably have a trick or 2 played on them at the beginning as a rite of passage. In addition, it is well known that Indians take particular pleasure in a harmless prank like this, where only a word or 2 is said as they ask some seemingly innocent questions. In this case, the boat they had assigned to the student had an outboard motor equipped with a freight propeller, good for hauling heavy loads, towing barges, etc., but not good for speed. There was no way he could have kept up. After that trial by freight prop, he was able to find his way back and forth through the islands very well for the rest of that summer. He got to know 2 or 3 different passages and never got lost again. He was working at the same job in the second summer when one day he cut between 2 islands from one route to another, and suddenly the whole map of the lake fell into place in his head. He no longer had to confine himself to 2 or 3 well-known passages, but could find his way anywhere on that big, complex lake. Hot Rock. My colleague Ann Colley and I were on a circuit visiting 4-H clubs in northern Saskatchewan, and we found ourselves obliged to search for accommodation and our evening meal at the small settlement of Coal Bay on the shores of Canoe Lake, where amenities were scarce. We were able to rent 2 non-modern cabins and buy a few groceries with which to make supper. The temperature outside was minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, with a bitter wind and blowing snow. Our cabins weren't much warmer inside because the walls were single-ply and not insulated. The situation did not faze my old-timer colleague in the least. She had coped with much worse and immediately set about calling on knowledge and experience beyond anything I had. I quickly got a fire going in the wood-burning cook stove while Ann put together a supper of something like Spam, canned peas, and fried potatoes. Our cabins were warm enough when the fire got going, but we knew they would freeze cold in no time unless we got up to put wood on the fire about every half hour through the night. Ann had a solution. She sent me out to find a couple of round rocks 8 to 10 inches in diameter and had me put the rocks in the oven while we had supper. After supper, she wrapped the 2 hot rocks in towels and gave one to me with instructions to put it under the covers at the foot of my bed for the night. I returned to my freezing cabin and followed Ann's instructions. I didn't even take time to light a fire, but quickly got ready for bed and climbed in under the covers and gingerly put my feet down onto the towel-wrapped rock. I couldn't believe the effect. Within minutes I was too hot and had to throw off some of the covers. It seems that, when your feet are warm, you are warm all over. After hearing about the use of heated rocks to help keep you warm for winter travel in sleighs, cutters, etc., in the open air, I finally experienced their dramatic effect. In spite of the fact that it was below freezing in the cabin, I slept well and my rock was still warm in the morning. The sales call. The flatware salesman, as a result of keeping an eagle eye on the social column of the Winnipeg Free Press, had determined that there was likely the potential of selling a range of expensive items to this young couple that was about to set up house together. This was back in the days when most young engaged couples like Carol and me did not live together before marriage. On their wedding day, they would move directly out of their parents' homes and therefore owned nothing but the clothes on their backs. An appointment was duly arranged for early on a spring evening at the home of my future mother-in-law in Fort Garry, Manitoba. Sad to say, however, the salesman was faced with an uphill battle on this occasion. First, he had the problem of explaining to me what flatware was. It was not, apparently, a lot of bits that had been run over by a large truck. It was, instead, a line of very expensive metal shaped into things that would not only be useful in our future kitchen and dining room, but it would also be very effective at emptying our bank account. But this was only his first obstacle. He wished first to set up a slide viewer to show us colored photographs of his product line. He looked around for a table and spotted Carol's mom's lovely occasional table in a corner of the living room. He cleared it of various ornaments, moved it to a convenient spot, flipped up one of the leaves and set up his viewer, plugged it in, and started the show. Unfortunately, he did not lock the support arm for the leaf, so about 4 pictures into the show, the leaf gave way and his viewer fell to the floor, blowing out the bulb and bringing his picture show to a premature end. That little table occupies a place of honor in our home to this day. He then began showing what he had in his case, which led to an argument about cutlery. He began by pushing sterling silver. We countered with stainless steel. He grudgingly admitted that stainless steel might be all right for every day, providing you never let the neighbors see it, but one certainly needed sterling silver when guests came for dinner. We countered with silver plate. He sneered at the idea, saying that the plate would wear off. We said if you're only using it for special occasions, the plate wouldn't wear off in 2 lifetimes. He said it would. I said, what about Winfield? He said, what? I said, well, there's a Winfield silverware shop on Bond Street, north of Portage, selling silver plate that carries a lifetime guarantee. He said, impossible. No company could offer such a guarantee. In retrospect, he was right, because Winfield's silver went out of business shortly thereafter. For this occasion, however, Winfield helped us to avoid spending a lot of money on sterling silver. We had already chosen silver plate, so no sale there. Doggedly, the salesman then went through his pot and pan selection. We didn't buy any of it either. He finally gave up, packed up his display case and broken viewer, and headed for the door. As he reached the porch, I said, watch out for the... Too late. His hand was already on the wet paint. I had painted the porch door earlier that day. He went down the sidewalk looking sadly at his green hand, probably wondering about trying a different line of work. Secret password. I've attended service club meetings from time to time. Service clubs do some good things, but I've never been inclined to join one. One of the things that didn't impress me was that they excluded women, although some of them had women's auxiliaries. For example, the Cosmo Club had Cosmo Pals, and the Kinsman Club had, and I believe still has, Kinettes. Another thing that doesn't appeal to me is the various rituals and ceremonies, not to mention fines and penalties, that are also part of the service club scene. Clearly, most service club members enjoy this sort of thing, but I'm afraid I don't. I once had some exposure to that oh-so-secretive service club, the Masons, when my work colleague Frank invited me to accompany him to an evening initiation ceremony. We were sitting in a big circle around a room, and after Grand Poobah number 1 gave a talk about the wonders of becoming a member, Grand Poobah number 2 came down the row asking each initiate to whisper the password and give him the secret handshake. It should be noted that Grand Poobah may not be the correct title for the men who are officiating that night, but I wanted to provide the most impressive title possible. Unfortunately, as Grand Poobah number 2 moved along the row, Frank, who was seated on my right, realized that he had forgotten the secret password. Oops! Grand Poobah number 2 was coming along the row to my left. Frank became more and more agitated. He strained to hear what was being said by each initiate in turn as Grand Poobah number 2 came closer. He completely missed what was said by the initiate 2 away from me on my left. One more chance. Frank strained to the utmost to hear what was whispered by the initiate immediately to my left, but couldn't. Grand Poobah number 2 passed over me and began the secret handshake with Frank. And then I heard the following whispered exchange. Grand Poobah number 2, what's the secret password? Frank, I've forgotten. Grand Poobah number 2, abracadabra. This may not have been it, but let's just say for purposes of this story that it was. Frank, abracadabra. And that's how Frank became a member of the Winnipeg branch of the Masons. What you deserve. I was at my fiance's home one day and was writing a letter to a friend. The first paragraph began, "I'm sitting in Carol's living room, reading the paper, talking to her, watching TV, and writing it to you. So you can see that you're getting all the attention you so richly deserve." My old friend Ken Sanderson knew I was inclined to be a multitasker, but this was ridiculous. He also got an adjustment to his sense of self-worth. Accidental punch bowl. We have a very nice punch bowl. I call it our accidental punch bowl. We have enjoyed using it for many years. The winter streets of Winnipeg and the generosity of my cousin Flora deserve credit for this acquisition. It was 1958, the first year of our marriage, and Carol and I planned to hold an open house for friends and family in our first home, an apartment on the second floor of a wonderful old house on Westgate in Winnipeg. I stand to be corrected, but I think this was both our first and last open house. We decided to serve punch, and therefore needed a punch bowl. We didn't want to buy one, given that this was to be our first and last, as it turned out, open house. So I arranged to borrow one from my cousin Flora. Let me pause here to talk about the winter streets of Winnipeg in those days. Winnipeg can get quite a lot of snow in some winters, but at that time there was not enough snow-clearing equipment to do more than plow the main streets. The result was that drivers on the side streets were left to sink or swim, as it were. In big snow winters, as the side streets got narrower and narrower from snow piled up along the curbs, a lot of cars got stuck trying to park. Other drivers could be seen shoveling and pushing to help stuck cars get out so they could take their turn driving into the bad spot to get stuck themselves. In fact, when people saw cars stuck in the street in front of their houses, they would put on their winter clothes and come out to help too. The other distinguishing characteristic of the side streets was their icy ruts. They were rounded at the bottom and got deeper and deeper and icier as the winter wore on. You could move along in the ruts quite well and really didn't need to steer because the wheels would just stay in the ruts like a train on a track. You could even turn the front wheels sideways, but your car would pay no attention and continue moving straight ahead. Mind you, you had to stay somewhat alert when you had your front wheels turned because the ruts weren't perfect. Sometimes there was a lump of ice or a crack in the side of the rut that would bounce the front wheels out of the track, putting you at risk of banging into one of the cars parked alongside. However, there was a problem. When you met another car coming toward you in the other direction, because neither of you could get out of the ruts and there was simply not enough room to get by anyway, the only solution was for one of you to back up to the nearest intersection, where the confusion of crisscrossing ruts would allow the two cars to get around each other. The crisscrossing ruts in the intersection provided another opportunity to get stuck, which in turn would bring the intersection people out of their houses to help, thus giving everyone a chance to meet even more new people who would stop what they were doing to help someone get unstuck. Winnipeg is a very friendly city. My personal theory is that Winnipeg's rutty winter roads of yesteryear is one of the causes of this admirable city characteristic. There has been so much interaction around getting stuck and getting unstuck that every Winnipegger sees in every other Winnipegger someone who would be willing to spend a pleasant hour up to their butt in snow at minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, shoveling and pushing to help your car get unstuck. It's an example of adversity bringing people together. You could argue that more credit for this should go to Red River flooding or mosquitoes or any one of a number of other common enemies that Winnipeggers face. But my money is on the rutty winter roads of years gone by. Now, where was I? Oh yes, the punch bowl. Flora met me at the door and handed me her beautiful glass punch bowl with a dozen beautiful glass cups arranged neatly inside it. As I headed across the street to the car, my foot slipped in one of the aforementioned icy ruts, and I lost my balance. I didn't fall, but in the process of regaining my balance and not dropping the punch bowl, most of the cups flew up into the air as high as 3 feet. I very skillfully caught all the cups in the punch bowl as they came down, but as you can imagine, they didn't all survive. 3 of them broke. I was so embarrassed that I bought a new punch bowl with cups for Flora to replace hers and the 3 broken cups. She absolutely refused to accept the replacement punch bowl, insisting that the broken cups weren't a problem. So we ended up with a brand new punch bowl set, and we've had it ever since. Motel security. Gretna is a small town in the mainly Mennonite farming area of southern Manitoba, just north of the Canada-US border. One night after my day's work, I was too tired to drive any further and checked into a very small motel for the night. I recall being given room 2. There were 4 rooms in total, and that it was accessed by an internal hallway leading from the office. Even by my standards, the room was minimal accommodation. Iron bedstead with sagging mattress, 1 straight-back chair, 1 light bulb hanging from the ceiling, painted tongue and groove, wooden walls and ceiling, linoleum floor, 1 hook on the back of the door, and bathroom down the hall. There was, however, a second door in the room, held closed by a kitchen knife stuck in the door jamb. I thought, aha, a closet. I pulled the knife out of the jamb and opened the door to find an adjoining room with a guy wearing a nightshirt sitting on his bed facing me and looking down at the floor. He didn't even look up as I quietly closed the door and stuck the knife back in the door jamb. Security for me, not so much for him, especially with the knife on my side. First and only time I've ever seen a guy wearing a nightshirt. Passenger pigeons. One of the amusing things about riding the Underground in London is watching the very dignified male commuters in bowler hats carrying the Times and an expensive briefcase walk onto the tube, with an equally dignified pigeon walking beside them. Pigeons hitch rides in the more outlying parts of London where the tube travels along the surface in places. I've seen pigeons fly onto the platform, walk onto the train alongside other passengers, and walk off again a few stops later. I've even seen them on routes where they get onto the surface platform, ride underground for a few stops, and get off at another surface platform. London pigeons apparently have figured out that there's a lot less wear and tear on the wings by riding the tube than by flying all that way. I think when we're considering which creatures will inherit the earth after the demise of humans, London pigeons will give cockroaches a run for their money. Hat only. 4-H is the name of a rural program that is common all over North America. The H stands for Head, Heart, Health and Hands. One year, the Canadian 4-H Conference was held at the Royal York Hotel in Toronto. The annual Shriners Convention happened to take place in the same hotel at the same time. The 4-H kids were enjoying the big city and that wonderful old hotel, Toronto landmark that it is. The Shriners were enjoying it too, although with a greater proportion of liquid in their diet. One evening, a Shriner, who had taken the liquid intake program more seriously than most of the others, had got into one of the elevators wearing nothing but a hat. He pushed the buttons at random, and when the door opened, doffed his hat, bowed in a courtly manner, and said in a slurred voice, "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen." The crowd waiting outside the bank of elevators, ladies in evening gowns and gentlemen in tuxedos, were more than a little surprised to be greeted in this way. In fact, several of the ladies screamed loudly, while a few of the men rushed off to call hotel security to deal with the situation. This was easier said than done, however, because the hat-only wearing Shriner continued pushing the elevator buttons at random, greeting the assembled ladies and gentlemen in the same way at various random floors where his elevator stopped. Meanwhile, the security people were trying to catch him without success. They would hear screams from the 5th floor, and using the stairs would pound down to that floor. Then screams would emanate from the 7th floor, and they would charge up 2 floors, only to hear screams from the 3rd floor, and so on. Hotel security took quite a while to catch up to the hat-only wearer, wrap him in a blanket, and bundle him off to his room. But before they did, many hotel guests were exposed, so to speak, to the warm and friendly greeting of a very happy and outgoing Shriner. Pontoon ride. Greenhorns, particularly university students on summer jobs, almost invariably have a trick or two played on them by the old-timers when they first report for work. How you handle it determines how well you're going to fit into the group. The late Keith Bogan, a former colleague of mine in the Prudential Insurance office in Winnipeg, had a summer job assisting a bush pilot to fly in equipment for mine survey teams working in northern Manitoba. He was to do the grunt work, loading the equipment and supplies onto the plane before the trip and hauling it out again for the surveyors in their various camps. Float planes, otters, beavers, and Cessnas, depending on the size of the load to be carried, were the only way to do it. On one occasion, they had to supply 2 camps, one at each end of a long, narrow lake. Keith had just finished schlepping all the stuff off the plane at the first camp and was about to climb back into the plane for the trip down the lake to the second camp when the pilot said, I'm just going to taxi down to the other camp, so you might just as well stand there on the float and hang on. You can see what's coming, can't you? The plane took off and flew down the lake with Keith standing on the float hanging on like grim death, the pilot laughing his head off, and the surveyors watching in the other camp thinking up a comment or two with which to greet Keith when he landed. Timesheets. My first job after graduation from university was with the second largest life insurance company in the world at the time, the Prudential Insurance Company of America. John Hancock was the largest insurance company at that time. It was my first experience with bureaucracy and my first glimpse of understanding how to deal with it. For example, the head of administration in our Winnipeg office issued a directive to the effect that people below a certain rank were not allowed to have keys to the office. This meant that my key was taken away from me, which in turn meant that I could not get to work as early as I'd like to do in order to get started on my paperwork before the phone started ringing. I was annoyed, but a directive is a directive. However, the memo also said that junior people, that was me, could borrow a key anytime they needed one, provided it was returned to administration the next morning. Okay, I thought, let's test it. So every night for the next 2 weeks, I borrowed a key from the head of administration and politely and conscientiously returned it the next morning. Finally, the head couldn't stand it any longer. One afternoon, he arrived at my desk, put a key down in front of me, and without saying a word, turned and walked back to his office. Another directive came all the way from corporate headquarters in Newark, New Jersey. It said that field staff, whose jobs required them to travel, and who presumably were always goofing off, would be required every 30 minutes to stop and record what they were doing. We tried to ignore this stupidity and ended up completing the sheets retrospectively at the end of the week or even sometime the following week, when for sure we couldn't remember what we had been doing the previous week. The supreme irony was that when we were really busy, we didn't have time to complete the timesheets, and when we weren't busy, we didn't have anything to put on the list. And there was a limit to how many times you can use the phrase office routine without letting head office know that we hadn't a bloody thing to do that week. Thus, each week, our little corner of the office had no choice but to participate in fellow field staffer Keith Bogan's struggle to complete last week's timesheet, as he asked questions like, "What am I going to do last Tuesday?" This particular bureaucratic nonsense came to a halt in a satisfying way when one young farm appraiser in one of the Midwestern states in the U.S. was to have a visitor from Newark travel with him for a while as he went about his work. The young appraiser had been treating the timesheet matter with the same careless abandon as the rest of us, but he thought he should take it a bit more seriously while traveling with this senior person from head office. After all, this might even be the guy who had sent out the directive. Accordingly, he stopped what he was doing every 30 minutes and made a note in his notebook about what he was doing. It got particularly bizarre when they were going somewhere that involved a drive of 2.5 hours. Every 30 minutes, he would pull off onto the shoulder of the road, make a note that they were driving from A to B, and then from B to C, and then C to D, etc. After 2 or 3 of these stops, the bigwig from HQ asked why they were stopping so often and what he was writing each time. The young guy told him about the timesheets they were required to keep. The HQ guy said, "Just keep driving, we'll see about this." The directive was withdrawn, never to appear again. Dictation disaster. In the early 1970s, Herb Clark occupied the office next to mine on the second floor of Kirk Hall at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon. We shared a secretary, Sandra Say, who had the office next to Herb's. In those days, before computers, I drafted letters and other documents by hand using the cut and paste method, the real cut and paste method, using scissors, paper, and glue, not your namby-pamby electronic cut and paste as we know it today. I would prepare material for Sandra to type that was, as far as I could make it, properly worded, correctly punctuated, and set out in the correct order. All Sandra had to do was type it as I gave it to her. I hope she agrees with this rosy picture of the quality of material I gave to her. Sandra was the soul of discretion, never gossiping or saying anything critical about other staff members. She was a thoroughly good person, hard-working, and a wonderful secretary. One day, however, she came into my office, closed the door, and did something completely un-Sandra-like. She told me about something Herb had done that had driven her, this is Sandra we're talking about, bananas. Dictaphones were all the rage at the time, in the mid-1970s, the idea being that they would increase efficiency in the office. Someone had made the mistake of giving one to Herb, on the assumption that it would also increase his efficiency. This did not prove to be the case for Sandra, especially on this particular occasion. Herb, dictaphone in hand, began dictating a letter to a person the spelling of whose name was somewhat in doubt in Herb's mind. The name was Douglas Thompson, with a P, or possibly Douglas Thompson without a P. Herb took up the dictaphone and began specifying that this was a letter to Mr. Douglas Thompson, Thompson with a P, with copies to be sent to 3 people, as well as a file copy. He gave the inside address and the salutation, "Dear Mr. Thompson." It was quite a chatty letter. Succinct would not be the first word that came to mind. In the first paragraph, Herb said he hoped Mrs. Thompson was in good health, together with all the little Thompsons. 2 paragraphs on, near the bottom of page 1, Herb says into the dictaphone, "I'm sorry, Sandra, but it's Thompson without a P." It meant that Sandra had to change not only the top copy, but the 4 carbon copies as well, including the best wishes to Mrs. Thompson and all the little Thompsons, without a P. Then somewhere well along in the page 2, Herb dictated, "Oh, sorry, Sandra, I was right the first time. It's Thompson with a P." This caused Sandra even more difficulties. After finishing page 2, she had to reload page 1, do her best to line up all the copies as well as she could, and change the correction back, including the best wishes to Mrs. Thompson and all the little Thompsons with a P. Finally, just as the letter was nearing its end, 3/4 of the way down page 3, Herb said, "Oh, don't bother with his letter, Sandra. Doug just called and we got it all straightened out over the phone." Sandra's reaction coming into my office to tell me about it was extreme. For her, she just needed to talk about it. Anybody else would have wanted to boil him in oil, and that would have been letting him off easy. Kelly. Another wonderful secretary on the U of S Extension Division staff at that time was Kelly, who was secretary to the executive director, Harold Baker. Kelly was very fast, very efficient, and very no-nonsense. She reveled in her status as secretary to and gatekeeper for the executive director. She could type fast, especially when she was displeased about something. The other actor in this piece was Professor Dave Robinson, who had a joint appointment between the Department of Horticulture and the Extension Division. Robinson was reasonably effective at transplanting a tomato seedling, but paperwork was another story. He was nearing retirement and was slowing down, having not been exactly speedy to start with. At a certain point, secretarial assignments in the division were reshuffled, and it was decided that Kelly, in addition to her duties as secretary to the executive director, should also handle Robinson's work. Kelly was not pleased. She now had both the highest status secretarial role in the division and the lowest. It wasn't the extra work that bothered her. Robinson was lucky if he produced 1 letter a month. But from Kelly's point of view, it was the indignity of it all. Several weeks later, Robinson had a letter to write. It took him all morning. He consulted Herb Clark about it several times. He redrafted it twice. Finally, it was ready, all 3 short handwritten paragraphs of it. He shuffled downstairs to Kelly, who looked very stormy when he gave it to her. He shuffled out of Kelly's office toward the stairs, heading back up to his office. Someone said hello to him in the stairwell. As he turned to respond, he didn't notice Kelly pass behind him, first up the stairs at a run, and then back down the stairs at a run. Kelly, in a fury, had done Robinson's letter immediately. It took her 12 seconds to type it, complete with carbon file copy on the envelope, and another 15 seconds to run up the stairs, put the letter on Robinson's desk, and return to her office. Robinson finished his short chat, no doubt about the weather, a topic always of interest to horticulturists, and shuffled back to his office. There on his desk was the completed paper he had spent all morning working on. He stared at it, picked it up in disbelief, put it down again as if it was too hot to handle, picked it up again, and carried it across the hall to show it to her. The old horticulturist was dumbstruck. He couldn't believe it. He had seen miracles before, the miracle in the sprouting of a tomato seed, for example, but this was the first time he'd experienced a miracle in paperwork. I don't know whether Dave Robinson ever wrote another letter. He may have decided his nerve wouldn't stand it and spent the rest of his time before retirement in the sanctity of the greenhouse. Expert. Occasionally, when I have a talk to deliver, I have been introduced as an expert. Under such circumstances, it is sometimes useful to be able to define expert. X is the unknown quantity, and spurt is a drip under pressure. This usually puts the audience in a good mood and gives them a more realistic view of how expert the speaker really is. Hands-on. Al Wickstrom, a young Saskatoon friend, got a degree in education with a special education specialty, and landed a position in Rosetown, Saskatchewan, primary school teaching, a class of 7 or 8 children with special needs. The job was demanding and difficult, and after a year or two he decided it wasn't worth the stress. So he moved back to Saskatoon, where he opened a shoe repair shop. Talk about a complete change. He started small, but he did good work, his business grew, and he had to hire staff and increase the size of his shop to keep up with demand. His shop became a gathering place when, from time to time, the machinery would be moved back against the wall to make room for theater nights put on by various small theater groups of the day. Al didn't want a big shoe repair shop with staff to manage and all the headaches of a dynamic and growing business, so he sold out to his employees and opened a small one-person shop down the street. But the same thing happened. His new small business grew to the point where he again sold out to his employees, opened yet another small shop down the street. I've lost track of how many times this happened, but the point is, he had finally found his niche. He had the capability to be a good teacher, and he had the capability to grow and manage a business, but he didn't want to. He wanted to work with his hands in a small shop, make a reasonable living, and interact with his customers on a first-name basis. I think most people would have had the opposite reaction to Al. They would build on their success and grow their business, open a second shoe repair shop, then a chain of shoe repair shops, be traveling all the time, never see their family, not have a personal relationship with their customers, then develop an ulcer or have a heart attack and be really, really happy. The joke's on us. Another story about a student summer job that I heard on CBC radio, which of course means that it must be true, involves summer jobs in Kenora, a small town in eastern Saskatchewan. A student was to be an office boy for the summer in the local branch of the Royal Bank of Canada. No sooner had he reported for work on his first day than the accountant, with a wink at the other staff, asked the new lad to go down the street to their competitor bank in town, the Bank of Nova Scotia, and bring back their general ledger. So the kid, green as grass and knowing nothing about anything, did as he was told and headed out the door, leaving the rest of the RBC staff almost rolling on the floor with laughter. The general ledger, in those days before computers, was the most sacred and confidential document in any bank branch. The Royal Bank Group knew that their student would be laughed out of the Bank of Nova Scotia and come back up the street looking very foolish. The only problem was that the first person the RBC lad encountered in the Bank of Nova Scotia was another green as grass student with a summer job at the bank. The B of NS lad, also knowing nothing about anything, gave the Royal Bank office boy the B of NS general ledger without giving it a second thought. One might ask whether he even gave it a first thought. The Royal Bank lad headed back up the street with the B of NS general ledger tucked under his arm and handed it to the accountant. The anticipated hilarity didn't happen. In fact, there was great consternation, not to say red faces, at the RBC. The manager had to make a very worried phone call to his counterpart at the B of NS, swear everybody to secrecy, and smuggle the B of NS general ledger back to its rightful spot in its rightful home without, and I can't stress this strongly enough, ever looking at it. The top half. Our resident solicitor in the Prudential office in Winnipeg was Don McCarthy. He was good at his job, which involved, among other things, handling cases where a foreclosure was in progress, as well as those where borrowers were so badly in arrears on their mortgage payments that legal action was necessary. There was a university professor in Saskatoon who was usually at least 3 months in arrears and who was in and out of foreclosure or close to it all the time. His was not a hardship case. He was on a professor's salary and had lots of equity in the house. He simply refused to pay unless legal action was in progress. In addition, he blamed us at Prudential for all his troubles. We had a thick file on him because he was always writing long, abusive letters, and of course there were many of our letters in their file too, including Don's replies. One day, Don came down the hall with an expression on his face that was a mixture of delight and fear. Our delinquent professor had written a letter saying he was totally fed up with dealing with us, so here was his proposal. His bungalow was worth about $16,000, and the mortgage balance was about $8,000. Thus, he owned approximately 50% of the house, and we owned about 50%. He proposed to burn down his half, so which half did we want? Don said what he had done was totally unprofessional, not to say unlawyer-like, and he might lose his job over it, but he couldn't resist. He had written back to say we would take the top half. Shortly after that, the guy sold his house and paid off the mortgage. We never heard from him again. Maybe he had a sense of humor, too. Woodsman saves $3. Doug Davidson, one of my Winnipeg Prudential Insurance colleagues, planned a nice Sunday afternoon outing with the kids while saving money at the same time. Christmas trees were selling in those days for $5 in the city, but a $2 permit would allow you to cut your own tree at a forest reserve 50 miles east of the city. Doug bought the permit, and they set out, arrived at the entrance to the reserve, parked the car, got the axe out of the trunk, and headed into the reserve. Unfortunately, the trees didn't look quite as perfect up close as they did from a distance. They were too large or too small, or crooked, or didn't have a good top, etc. They walked around in the reserve for quite a while before finding just the right one. Once they agreed on a good tree, Doug squatted down, scrabbled awkwardly to a position under the lower branches, and took a mighty swing at the trunk. The result? A great load of snow fell from the branches, much of it down Doug's neck. The next problem was that the axe was rather dull, so it took a lot of hard swinging from Doug's awkward squatting position to make much of an impression on the tree trunk. The good news was that the amount of snow falling down Doug's neck diminished with each blow. Eventually, Doug managed to hack his way through the trunk, and the tree fell over. Doug and the kids then began dragging the tree back to the car, electing to take a direct route rather than the circuitous route they had followed while searching for the perfect tree, which led to another problem. They got lost. It took quite a while for them to reorient themselves, during which their wanderings took them across a muskeg, where one of Doug's feet broke through the icy crust, and his boot filled with frigid swamp water. Meanwhile, the tree became surprisingly heavy to drag during the hour it took to find their way back to the car. Driving home with the tree tied to the top of the car, Doug had time to reflect on the advantages of saving $3 when balanced against the various setbacks they had experienced, not to mention the gasoline used on the 100-mile round trip. On the plus side, the kids all found it quite entertaining, especially when snow fell down Dad's neck and icy water filled his boot. Add in Dad's muffled curses under his breath, and it was better than watching TV any day. Coriolis effect. I was taking a third-year biology course, along with most of my Aggie, College of Agriculture colleagues. My colleagues would rather not have been there. They wanted to study livestock and grain production and stay away from the arts and science buildings and the more esoteric courses given there. The other problem was that it was an 8:30 class, and if you're not going to be very interested in a course, the time to be most uninterested is at 8:30 on a winter morning. In contrast, I was moderately interested in the course and actually paid attention and took notes. Meanwhile, most of my classmates tried not to attract attention by snoring. The professor knew he did not have the rapt attention of his students, but he gave it the good old college try anyway. One morning, he reported on an experiment. He drew a half circle on a chalkboard representing a green twig that had been cut through and split in half lengthwise. The twig was then placed in water until buds began to sprout on the cut portion of the top. The diagram showed that the new buds were all crowded together in one corner, as if they had traveled in a clockwise direction and settled in the corner. The prof asked whether anyone could say why the buds might have bunched together in this way. When I asked whether the same experiment had ever been tried in the southern hemisphere, the prof almost jumped over his desk. I had had a rare moment of brilliance in which it occurred to me that the position of the buds might be due to the Coriolis effect, which causes water pouring down a drain to spin in a clockwise direction in the northern hemisphere and a counterclockwise direction in the southern hemisphere. My response had been right on, and was exactly what the prof had been hoping for, but not expecting from our bunch. He invited me to his office a few days later and encouraged me to aim for graduate studies in biology after graduation. This was not the life I envisioned for myself, so I turned him down. I think I did so politely, because it was a flattering offer, and all because I had made an obscure connection between a sprouting twig and an effect of the Earth's rotation. And you think you've got dirty socks. Sometimes the washing machine gets blamed for eating socks when the poor machine has been innocent all along. Socks had been disappearing all winter in the home of our Saskatoon friends, the Ollies, and the reputation of their washing machine had taken a beating. Eventually, when the long Saskatoon winter began to loosen its grip, some dark lumps started sticking up through the melting snow in the backyard. Shirley went out to investigate and discovered that the washing machine had been unfairly accused. The culprit was their dog Charlie, who had been stealing unwashed socks from the laundry basket, swallowing them, and depositing them in the snow in the backyard along with his regular deposits. Their vet concluded that Charlie had a salt deficiency and was attracted by the sweaty socks tossed in the laundry hamper by 4 very active kids when they came in from playing hockey or other vigorous winter sports. As far as Charlie was concerned, these dirty socks were just what the doctor, veterinarian, ordered. Shirley was nothing if not frugal, so after the snow melted, she retrieved the socks, separated them as much as possible from the you-know-what, ran them through the washing machine didn't really deserve this, and put the socks back into regular service. The only problem was that Charlie had been less than systematic in his choice of socks to swallow. Sometimes he got both socks of a pair, sometimes he didn't. Thus, with some pairs, one sock had been somewhat discolored by Charlie's stomach acids, while the other sock hadn't. The solution was to run the unaffected socks through Charlie in the hope of getting a better color match for the pair. Charlie, ever helpful and obedient dog, was quite willing to oblige. Alert readers may detect some exaggeration towards the end of this story. Wishing for water. Our Manitoba farm had a water problem. The only functioning well was the one in the barnyard, in which the water was alkaline. Water testing was almost unknown back then, but the water from that well was nearly undrinkable, suggesting high alkali levels as well as a high content of other minerals. There were failed wells all over our farmstead, some filled with stones, some with collapsed cribbing, some just abandoned. They had been dug in a vain attempt to find good water nearby. You never knew when you might come upon, stumble over, or even fall into one of these abandoned wells. My mother viewed the wells as a serious safety hazard from when my sister and I were little. We still needed a source of good water, so my grandfather decided to try again. He hired a water witcher, and they began searching in the field across the road from the farmstead. Wishing for water, also called divining or dowsing for water, is an ancient and controversial pursuit. Various scientific studies have shown that the results are no better than chance, but the practice continues. There are many believers, and there are witching societies in many countries. Digging or drilling a well is a costly and time-consuming endeavor. Even a farmer who has little faith in witching will often hire a witcher on the off chance there's something to it. When you're faced with a bill of $10,000 for drilling or digging what may turn out to be a dry well, spending another $100 or so for a water witcher is a small price to pay for a bit of reassurance. The water witcher Grandpa hired walked around with his forked stick and eventually pointed to a spot next to a poplar bush where he said there would be water. I was about 11 years old then. As the men began digging, I picked up the forked stick, held it, palms up, and with the main stem pointing straight ahead, I began walking around the same route used by the witcher. As I passed by where the digging was taking place, the stick twisted downward in my hands. I swear I didn't do anything except hold it firmly. I'm not kidding. The stick twisted strongly downward. There was no way I could stop it. The well diggers found good water there at 12 feet. It made a water witching believer out of me. Recently, an Ottawa City employee came to check on the location of the outside water shutoff valve, located somewhere below the surface of the middle of the front lawn where we live on Avenue Road. He had a sophisticated electronic detection device, but he also had a piece of wire that he used for witching. He said that he used both, and that the witching wire sometimes helped him locate a shutoff valve more reliably than the electronic gizmo. I was amazed that this old technology was still being used today. I'll take him. As you drive along Côte des Neiges in Montreal, you can see the huge dome of St. Joseph's Oratory looming up on a hill to the west. Among other features, it has the largest pipe organ ever built by the famed Quebec pipe organ maker Cassavant. The pipes of this massive instrument tower 9 stories high. A few years ago, the then 22-year-old organist was asked in a CBC interview how one so young came to occupy such a prestigious organist's position. He replied that his having been a child prodigy might have something to do with it. He recounted that he was already playing the piano at the age of 4, and his musical parents thought he was showing exceptional ability and wondered about lessons for him. They phoned a nun who gave piano lessons. When she found out how old he was, she refused him, saying she didn't usually take children till they were at least 7. They prevailed upon her to let them come so she could hear him play. He sat down at the piano and played some boogie-woogie. She asked if he could play anything classical, so he played a piece by Chopin. She said, "That's very nice. Where did you learn it?" He said, "From listening to a cassette tape belonging to his parents." She said, "The tape must have been running fast, because you're playing it in the wrong key. You're playing it in E, and it's supposed to be in E flat." She played the starting E flat chord for him. The little boy thought he had done something naughty, so he played it for her in E flat, transposing it on the fly. She said, "I'll take him."